The wind came low and dry across the basin, a lonely sound for a lonely man. It worried the loose board on the north side of the barn and whispered through the sparse, sun-bleached grass as if the land itself had something bitter to confess. Elias Thorne felt the whisper in his bones. For 20 years, the wind had been his most constant companion, its voice changing with the seasons but its message always the same: you are alone. He stood on the porch of the cabin he had built with younger, happier hands, watching the sun bleed out across the western ridge. The light painted the dust motes in the air, turning them to a haze of old gold, like memory. His stillness was a practice, a form of prayer for a God he no longer believed in. He was a man carved from the silence his life had become, weathered and unyielding as the granite outcrops that broke through the soil. He had buried his heart on this land, deep in the earth beside his wife and their small, breathless son. Since that day, he had built a fortress of solitude, its walls made of routine and its mortar of unspoken grief. He chopped wood, mended fences, drew water. He did not speak. He did not hope. He simply endured. That was why the shape crumpled near the creek bed was such a violation. It was an aberration, a tear in the fabric of his meticulously constructed emptiness. At first, he thought it was a deer, felled by a cougar. But the color was wrong, a deep, bruised blue of worn calico. He moved toward it without conscious thought, his steps measured, his face a mask of impassive stone. It was a woman. She lay face down, her dark hair splayed in the dust, one hand still clutching a pathetic, small bundle. Her form was substantial, broad of shoulder and hip, a sturdiness that life had clearly tried its best to break. He saw the scuffed soles of her shoes, the grime on her hem, the exhaustion settled so deep in her posture it seemed to have taken root in her very marrow. He didn't ask what brought her here. The wilderness that began at the edge of the bitter town of Redemption was a place people came to get lost, not to be found. He knelt, his knees cracking in the quiet. He saw the rise and fall of her back. Alive! A feeling he hadn't identified in 2 decades stirred in his chest, a weary, unwelcome sense of duty. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch calloused and unfamiliar even to himself. It was the first time he had touched another living soul since he had folded his wife's hands over her still chest. The woman flinched violently, a choked sound escaping her lips. She tried to scramble away, crab-like, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost feral. He saw it all in that one wild glance. She was expecting a blow, an insult, the final cruelty. He simply stood, raised his empty hands, and took a step back, giving her the space she craved. He waited. The wind sighed around them, and the last of the sun vanished, leaving the world in shades of grey and deepening purple. She did not speak. He did not ask. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, his boots crunching a steady, unhurried rhythm on the hard-packed earth. He did not look back to see if she was following. To look back would be an invitation, a question, and he had no questions left in him. He lit the lantern inside, its warm, yellow glow a small defiance against the encroaching dark. The light fell on the 2 rocking chairs by the cold hearth, one slightly smaller than the other. It fell on the mantel, on the single, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its painted wings forever poised for a flight it would never take. He moved to the dry sink, pumped water into a tin cup, and set it on the edge of the worn pine table. He took a loaf of dark bread from the cupboard, cut a thick slice, and placed it on a plate beside the cup. Then he went back to the porch and sat in the shadows, his presence a silent fact, neither threatening nor welcoming. He waited, listening to the night sounds, the crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the ceaseless lament of the wind. An hour passed. Then he heard it, a hesitant scrape of a worn shoe on stone, then another. She appeared at the edge of the lantern light, a ghost summoned from the twilight. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her expression a ruin of fear and exhaustion. She looked at him, then at the open doorway, then back at him. Her eyes were not asking for permission but assessing the nature of the cage. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod toward the cabin's interior. It was all he could offer. He watched her cross the threshold, a slow, painful shuffle as if wading against a current of pure dread. She stopped at the table, her gaze fixed on the bread and water. Her hands trembled as she reached for the cup, drinking in desperate, shuddering gulps. She did not touch the bread. She sank onto the floor, her back against the far wall, as far from him and the door as she could get. She drew her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself small, a fortress of her own. He saw the way she held herself, a woman braced for a storm that had already broken over her head. He picked up the woolen blanket folded on the back of his rocker, it still smelled faintly of lavender, the ghost of his wife's scent, and placed it on the floor, a few feet from her. He didn't look at her face. He returned to the porch, to the familiar company of the dark. He did not close the door. By dawn, the cold had seeped into the bones of the cabin. A thin film of ice webbed the water bucket. Elias rose from the porch chair, his body stiff. He had not slept. He had listened to the silence inside, a different kind of silence now, one that held a fragile, foreign heartbeat. He entered the cabin. She was asleep, curled beneath the blanket, her breathing deep and even. In sleep, the terror had receded from her face, leaving behind a profound weariness, the face of someone who had been fleeing for a very long time. He built a fire in the hearth, the snap and crackle of the kindling a sudden, sharp intrusion. Her eyes flew open, the fear instantly back in them. She scrambled upright, clutching the blanket to her chin like a shield. He paid her no mind, focusing on the flames, coaxing them to life. He set a pot of coffee to heat on the iron hook, the aroma filling the small space, a scent of simple, morning ritual. He did not look at her, did not speak a word. He was showing her, in the only way he knew how, that his world had a rhythm, and she was, for now, merely adjacent to it. She watched his every move. He was a large man, broad-shouldered from years of labor, but his movements were economical, deliberate. There was no wasted motion, no hint of agitation. He poured 2 cups of coffee, set one on the table, and took his own out to the porch. He left the bread from the night before where it was. An hour later, as the sun climbed higher, a wagon rattled up the track to his hollow. Sheriff Brody. The law in redemption was a man whose curiosity was perpetually at war with his laziness. Elias watched him approach, his face impassive. Brody was a man who fed on gossip like a stray dog on scraps. "Morning, Elias," Brody said, staying on his horse. He peered past Elias toward the cabin door. "Heard some commotion in town yesterday. Seems Jedediah's mail-order bride finally arrived on the stage." Except he took one look, declared her too fat for farm work, and left her standing in the dust. "Cold thing to do." Elias said nothing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Brody shifted in his saddle. "Thing is, she's gone. Just walked out of town. Some folks are worried. Others figure she was just a grifter. You ain't seen anyone wanderin' out this way, have you?" "A big woman," they said. Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. He let the silence stretch, thin and taut. Finally, he lowered the cup. "This hollow is empty, Sheriff." "Same as it's always been." His voice was rough from disuse. Brody's eyes narrowed, but he knew Elias Thorne. Elias did not lie, he simply omitted the world. After another moment of strained silence, the sheriff grunted. "Right then." Just checking. He turned his horse and rode away, the dust settling slowly behind him. When Elias went back inside, the cup on the table was empty and the slice of bread was gone. She was still on the floor, but the blanket was folded neatly beside her. It was a statement. A quiet thank you. An acknowledgement of a debt. He nodded once, to the empty room. The day passed in this new, shared silence. He split wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only conversation. She did not leave the cabin. Through the open door, he saw her find the broom and begin to sweep the floor, her movement slow and methodical. She was not cleaning for him. She was carving out a space for herself in the emptiness. The day settled into a strange, unspoken routine. He would rise before the sun, make coffee, and leave a portion of whatever he had, oatmeal, bread, a piece of salted pork, on the table. He would work the land until dusk, clearing stone from the fallow field, reinforcing the barn roof, his labor a constant battle against the slow decay of time and weather. She remained within the cabin or just outside the door, never venturing far. She washed their few dishes, swept the floor, mended a tear in one of his shirts with neat, careful stitches she must have made using a needle and thread from her own small bundle. He found the mended shirt folded on his chair one evening. The stitching was better than his own clumsy work. He acknowledged it with a slight dip of his head as he passed her, and he saw her gaze flicker down to her hands, as if embarrassed by the offering. Her name was Annalise. He learned it not because she spoke it, but because Sheriff Brody returned a week later, his face a mask of self-important concern. "Elias," he'd said, dismounting this time, his boots crunching with authority. "Jedediah's marking her a stink. Says that woman, Annalise, stole the train fare he sent her. Wants me to find her, bring her in for theft." Brody tried to peer inside the cabin again, but Elias stepped into the doorway, blocking the view. "I told you, Sheriff. The hollow is empty. Folks saw smoke from your chimney, Elias. You don't usually take to fires till the first frost of the nights are cold." The words were flat. Final. Brody licked his lips, his gaze shifting from Elias's granite face to the cabin behind him. "Jedediah's a man with influence, Elias. He says she's his property, in a manner of speaking. Paid for and all." A muscle in Elias's jaw tightened. "She's not here." It was a lie, the first he'd told in 20 years. It tasted like ash in his mouth, but it was a necessary stone in the wall he was building around this place. After Brody left, defeated, Elias walked not to the woodpile but to the creek. He stood for a long time, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. He had lied for her. He, who had cut himself off from all human connection, had tethered himself to this stranger with a falsehood. When he returned, she was standing on the porch, looking out at the small, fenced-in patch of earth behind the cabin. It was where he had buried them. 2 simple stone markers, worn smooth by years of wind and rain. The ground around them was choked with weeds, a testament to his neglect. He expected her to turn away, to respect the invisible boundary around his grief. But she didn't. She walked to the small plot, knelt, and with her bare hands, began to pull the weeds. She worked slowly, gently, her large frame bent in an attitude of quiet reverence. He watched, his chest tight, a knot of old pain and something new, something terrifyingly like warmth, pulling taut within him. She was not tidying a stranger's land. She was tending his sorrow. He let her work. He watched from the barn doorway as she cleared the last of the nettles and thistle from around the 2 stone markers. She did not try to scrub the moss from them or alter them in any way. She simply gave them space to breathe. When she was done, she found a patch of stubborn, wild primrose growing by the creek and carefully transplanted 3 of the small flowers to the cleared earth. A small, living offering to the dead she did not know. That evening, the silence at the table felt different. It was not an absence of sound, but a shared space, a vessel holding their unspoken histories. He noticed the way her hands, though chapped and stained with dirt, moved with a gentle grace as she ate the stew he had prepared. They were capable hands. He thought of Jedediah's cruel words, repeated by the sheriff, "Too fat for farm work." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an intrusion or a duty, but as a person. He saw not the size of her frame but the resilience that held it upright. He saw the strength in her shoulders, the quiet intelligence in her observant eyes. Jedediah had been a fool. That night, after she had retreated to her pallet on the floor, he did not go out to the porch. He sat in his rocker, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. He picked up a block of pine and his whittling knife. His hands, clumsy at first, slowly remembered the old motions. The knife peeled away layers, shaving by shaving, finding the shape hidden within the wood. It was not the perfect, graceful bird on the mantel, the one he had carved for his son on the boy's last birthday. This one was rougher, simpler. Its wings were not poised for elegant flight but were braced, as if for a hard wind. Its head was cocked, listening. In the morning, when she woke, the small, rough-hewn bird was sitting beside her folded blanket. She stared at it for a full minute, her expression unreadable. Then, she picked it up, her fingers tracing the knife marks on the wood. She held it as if it weighed more than pine, as if it were made of something far more precious. She looked across the room at him, where he was stoking the fire, his back to her. She didn't speak. But he felt her gaze on him, and for the first time, it was not filled with fear. It was filled with a question he was not yet ready to answer. She placed the bird on the small window sill beside her pallet, where the morning light could catch it. A guardian. A promise. A word spoken in the language of wood and silence. The thought came not just to the land, but to the hollow. Patches of green appeared on the hillsides, and the creek ran faster, swollen with melted snow from the high country. Anneliese began to spend more time outdoors, her initial circle of safety widening from the cabin to the porch, then to the creek bank. She had a quiet way with the world, a patient observation that Elias, in his own grief-shrouded solitude, had lost. She found where the wild onions grew, where the rabbits made their runs. One afternoon, he came back from the far pasture to find a small pot of broth simmering over the fire, seasoned with herbs he hadn't known were there. It was her first meal for him, a tentative offering that shifted the balance of their arrangement from host and refugee to something akin to partnership. He ate it, and the warmth spread through him in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. He began to speak, not in conversations, but in single words dropped into the silence like stones into a still pond. "Rain," he would say, looking at the clouds massing over the ridge. She would nod, bringing in the laundry she had washed and hung on a line between two trees. "Fence," he would state, picking up his tools. She would later appear with a pail of fresh water for him, setting it down without a word before retreating. Their communication was a thing of gesture and necessity, a language built for a world stripped of all that was frivolous. He started leaving the smaller of the two rocking chairs empty, a silent invitation. For weeks, she ignored it. Then one evening, as a cool rain drummed a soft rhythm on the roof, she hesitated, then slowly sat in it. The chair, built for his wife's slighter frame, creaked under her weight, but it held. They sat on either side of the hearth, the firelight dancing on their faces, the silence between them now comfortable, worn as an old coat. It was a fragile peace, and Elias knew it. The town of redemption, and the bruised ego of Jedediah, lay just over the ridge. He knew men like Jedediah. They could not abide a thing they had discarded, finding value elsewhere. It was an insult to their own judgment, a wrong that had to be righted with cruelty. He began oiling his father's old rifle, not out of aggression, but out of a grim sense of preparedness. He was no longer just protecting his solitude, he was protecting her. The day he had been bracing for arrived with the harsh glare of a high noon sun. Two riders crested the ridge, their shapes dark against the bright sky. He recognized Jedediah's swagger even from a distance. The other man was one of his hired hands, a lout named Caleb. Elias was mending a harness on the porch. He did not stop his work. He continued to pull the thread through the thick leather, his movement steady, his face betraying nothing. Anneliese was inside. He heard the rustle of movement cease, the sudden, sharp intake of her breath. She knew. Jedediah pulled his horse up a few yards from the porch, his face a sneer of contempt. He surveyed the small, clean cabin, the neatly stacked woodpile, his gaze lingering on the line of washed laundry. "Thorne," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Sheriff said you hadn't seen my property. Seems the sheriff needs to get his eyes checked." Elias finished his stitch, pulled it tight, and set the harness aside. He rose slowly to his feet. He was taller than Jedediah, broader in the shoulders. He stood in the doorway, a silent, immovable obstacle. "She's not your property," Elias said, his voice low and even. Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I paid her passage. She owes me. I came to collect." He swung down from his horse, Caleb following suit. Jedediah's eyes were on the cabin's dark interior, trying to see her. "Come on out, Anneliese." No sense hidden behind this mute. "We have a debt to settle." From inside, there was only silence. A profound, terrified silence. Elias saw the ghost of her past trauma rise, the public humiliation, the utter powerlessness. But this was not the town square. This was his hollow. "You'll leave now," Elias stated. It was not a request. Jedediah took a step toward the porch, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. "I'm not leaving without what's mine." "You want to keep her, you old hermit?" "You can pay her debt. $50. Or I'll take her back to town and see she works it off." The threat was vile, explicit. A cold, clean rage settled over Elias. It was an old feeling, one he had buried with his family. The feeling of a protector. "She stays," he said again, the words like chips of stone. Last chance, Thorned Jedediah drew his pistol. But he was a man used to bullying, not fighting. Elias moved with a speed that belied his size. He was not on the porch, he was on Jedediah in 2 long strides. He didn't go for the gun. He struck Jedediah's wrist with the side of his hand, a hard, sharp blow that sent the pistol flying into the dust. Before Jedediah could recover, Elias had him by the collar, lifting him half off his feet, his other hand gripping Jedediah's throat just enough to cut off his blustering words. Caleb, the hired hand, took a hesitant step forward, then stopped cold at the look in Elias's eyes. It was a look of absolute finality. "Get him on his horse," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "And get off my land." He shoved Jedediah toward Caleb. Jedediah stumbled, gasping, his face purple with rage and humiliation. He had come for a reckoning and found one, just not the one he'd intended. He shot a look of pure hatred at Elias, then at the dark doorway of the cabin. "This ain't over," he choked out. Elias simply picked up Jedediah's pistol from the dust, calmly unloaded it, and tossed the useless metal object and the bullets back at his feet. "It is," Elias said. He watched them mount their horses and retreat, their departure hasty and undignified. He stood there until they were gone, until the dust had settled, until the only sound was the wind, whispering through the grass. He turned and went back inside. Annalise was standing in the center of the room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was not crying. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fixed on him, blazing with an emotion he could not name. It was not fear. It was not gratitude. It was something fierce, something that had been forged in the heat of the moment. The confrontation had not broken her, it had galvanized her. The outside world, in the form of Jedediah, had come to claim her, to remind her of her shame, and it had been repelled. She had watched a man stand between her and her past, not with loud boasts or grand gestures, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty. He had not fought for her honor or her virtue. He had fought for her right to simply be. He picked up the harness he had been mending and sat back in his chair, his hands resuming their work. His heart was still hammering against his ribs, a wild drum of adrenaline, an old, resurrected feeling. He needed the simple, repetitive motion to ground himself. He needed the silence. But she crossed the room and stood before him. He kept his eyes on his work, waiting. He expected her to speak, to say thank you, to say something that would try to name the thing that had just happened between them. Instead, she knelt. She gently took the leather harness from his hands and set it aside. Then she took his hand in both of hers. His hand was rough, calloused, stained with dirt and work. Her hands were soft but strong, and they trembled slightly. She turned his hand over and looked at his knuckles, which were scraped raw from Jedediah's collar. She brought his hand to her lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to the broken skin. It was not a kiss of passion, but a profound acknowledgement. A quiet anointing. A benediction. He froze, every muscle in his body rigid. The touch was an electric shock, a current that jolted through 2 decades of numbness. He looked at her, truly looked at her kneeling before him. He saw the tears finally welling in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of release, of a dam of unshed grief and terror finally breaking. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. He did not pull his hand away. He let it rest in hers, a silent surrender. The world had shrunk to this single point of contact, his scraped knuckles, her soft lips, the shared warmth of their skin. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was full to bursting. It held the weight of his lie to the sheriff, the gift of a whittled bird, the tending of a grave, and the echo of a single, powerful word. Stays. He had built a fortress of solitude, and now, its gate was standing wide open. In the days that followed, the new silence settled between them, a language learned and understood. The memory of Jedediah's intrusion faded, not into nothingness, but into a scar that marked a boundary crossed and defended. It had defined the edges of their small world and made it, finally, a home. They worked without speaking of it, but with a new, shared rhythm. He would be splitting logs, and she would appear with the whetstone, knowing the axe was growing dull. She would be tending her small patch of herbs, and he would leave a newly crafted trowel by the door for her. The small, rough-hewn bird she kept on her windowsill was joined by another, a fox, its head tilted inquisitively. He had carved it for her the night after the confrontation. A second word in their silent vocabulary. One afternoon, he found her by the creek, weeping. It was not the desperate, panicked weeping of her arrival, nor the cathartic tears after the fight. This was a quiet, mournful sound, the sound of old wounds aching. He stood a few feet away, uncertain. The instinct to retreat, to give her the same space he had always craved, was strong. It was the law of his solitude. But he did not obey it. He walked to her side and stood there, a silent, steady presence. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply stood with her in her sorrow. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice thick. He said, "No one would ever." She couldn't finish the sentence. The shame Jedediah had branded her with was still a raw and tender thing. Elias looked not at her, but out at the creek, at the way the water flowed relentlessly onward, smoothing the sharpest edges of the stones in its path. He thought of the words he had never spoken to his wife, the comfort he had been unable to give or receive in the face of their own great sorrow. He had failed then. He would not fail now. He slowly, deliberately, reached out his hand. He did not touch her face or her hair. He laid his large, rough hand gently on her shoulder. The touch was solid. Grounding. It asked for nothing. It simply said, "I am here. You are not alone in this." She leaned into his touch, just slightly, a silent acceptance of the comfort he offered. It was the first time he had initiated contact, the first time he had reached across the chasm of his own grief to touch another's. His hand on her shoulder was a bridge. They stood like that for a long time, until her weeping subsided into shuddering breaths, until the sun began to dip behind the ridge, and the only sound was the water flowing over the stones, washing the world clean. Spring deepened into summer. The sun baked the earth, and the hollow bloomed with a wild, rugged life. The fallow field Elias had been clearing of stones was finally ready. One morning, he carried out a sack of seed potatoes and a hoe. He drove the hoe into the dark, rich earth, turning it over. Annalise came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron she had fashioned from an old flour sack. She watched him for a moment, then went back inside, returning with a small cloth bag of her own. It held seed she had carefully harvested from wild plants and others she must have carried with her on her long journey, beans, squash, and hardy greens. She walked to the far end of the newly tilled plot and, using the trowel he had made her, began to dig her own small holes, dropping seeds into the soil with a practiced, gentle touch. They worked the long row together, starting at opposite ends and moving toward the middle. The sun was warm on their backs. The earth smelled of life and promise. There was no plan, no discussion. There was only the shared, rhythmic work of cultivation. They were planting a garden in the place where he had only ever buried his hopes. He watched her as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He saw the strength in her back as she bent to the earth, the sureness in her hands as she patted the soil over the seeds. Jedediah's cruel pronouncement, "too fat for farm work," seemed like a blasphemy here, in the face of this quiet, capable industry. She was not just made for this work, she was remaking the world with it. They met in the middle of the row, their work complete. They stood for a moment in the comfortable silence, surveying the turned soil, the promise of a harvest buried within it. the land no longer felt like a place of penance. It felt like a beginning. "It's good ground," she said, her first unsolicited words about the land, about their future. Her voice was soft, but steady. He looked at the field, then at the cabin, then at her. He thought of the 2 graves on the hill, of the empty rocker, of the 20 years of silence. They were all still there, part of the landscape of his life. But now, there was this. There was a garden. There was a woman who tended his sorrow and planted beans in his fallow field. "Yes," he said, his own voice sounding strange to his ears, fuller than it had been in years. It is he looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small thing, a slight upturning of his lips, a crinkling at the corners of his eyes. But it felt like a sunrise after a long, dark night. She smiled back, a broad, radiant smile that transformed her face, and the whole hollow seemed to brighten with it. The wind came up then, but it was no longer a lonely sound. It was just the wind, moving through the leaves, whispering of rain and growth and all the things that were yet to come.